At some point, a thought appears, and without even noticing it, you treat it as something that belongs to you, not just something that happened in your mind, but something that represents you. Your opinion, your perspective, your reaction. It feels automatic. There's no separation between the thought and who you are. It doesn't feel like something you're observing, it feels like something you're thinking. And that difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Because when a thought feels like you, it carries more weight. It feels more important, more personal, more real. You don't question it in the same way you don't step back from it. You move with it, follow it, build on it. And that's where the experience begins, not just thinking, but identifying with what you're thinking. So when the thought changes, your state changes. When the thought repeats, it feels like something about you is repeating. And over time, that connection becomes so consistent that it feels natural, like thoughts are not just something you have, but something you are. And that's where the confusion starts. Your brain doesn't separate thoughts from identity in a clear way. It processes everything through the same system. A thought appears, and your awareness registers it immediately. There is no label that says this is just a thought. It simply becomes part of your experience. Because of that, the mind treats thoughts as if they are meaningful signals, something to respond to, something to interpret, something to act on, and that creates a link. The thought appears and your system reacts to it as if it is relevant to who you are. That reaction reinforces the connection. Over time, this becomes automatic. Thoughts are no longer just events, they are treated as extensions of your perspective. So when a thought appears, it doesn't feel separate. It feels like something coming from you, something that reflects you. And because it feels that way, it is harder to question, harder to step back from, harder to see as something independent. This is how identity becomes attached to thinking, not through intention, but through repetition. There is also a deeper reason this connection feels so strong. Your brain is constantly trying to create a consistent sense of self. It wants your experiences, your thoughts, and your reactions to align in a way that feels coherent. So when a thought appears, it is automatically integrated into that sense of self. It becomes part of the ongoing narrative your brain is constructing. That narrative is what makes you feel like a continuous person. It connects past, present, and future into something that feels stable. But the thoughts themselves are constantly changing. They appear and disappear, shift and repeat, vary in tone and direction. And yet, because they are all integrated into the same narrative, they feel like they are coming from the same place. From you. This is what makes it difficult to see thoughts as separate, because your brain is actively working to make them feel connected to your identity. And the more that connection is reinforced, the more natural it feels, even when it isn't accurate. Another factor is how quickly thoughts appear and are experienced. There is no delay, no visible gap between the thought forming and you being aware of it. It feels immediate. Because of that, it feels like you are creating the thought in real time, like it is something you are actively producing. But if you look closely, you don't choose the next thought before it appears. It arrives and then you become aware of it. That sequence is easy to miss because it happens so quickly, but it changes how thoughts can be understood. They are not always something you decide. They are something that appears within your awareness. And once they appear, you relate to them as if they are yours. That's what creates the illusion. Not the thought itself, but how it is experienced, as something that originates from you, rather than something that arises within you. And that distinction is what begins to separate thinking from identity. What strengthens this illusion even further is how your mind reacts to thoughts once they appear. The moment a thought enters awareness, there is often an immediate response. Agreement, disagreement, analysis, emotion. Something happens almost instantly. That response makes the thought feel active. It turns it into something that is being engaged with, something that is being processed, something that feels personal. And because that response happens so quickly, it blends into the thought itself. It doesn't feel like a separate step. It feels like part of the same experience. So instead of seeing a thought followed by a reaction, it feels like a single continuous event, a thought that you are actively involved in. This reinforces the idea that the thought belongs to you, that it reflects you, that it is something you are thinking rather than something you are observing. And over time, this pattern becomes automatic. Every thought is followed, reacted to, expanded, and that constant engagement is what keeps the connection between thoughts and identity so strong, not because they are the same, but because they are never experienced as separate. There is also a strong emotional component that deepens this connection. When a thought carries emotion, it feels more real, more significant, more connected to you. Emotion adds intensity. It makes the thought stand out. It gives it weight, making it feel like something that matters. And because it feels like it matters, your mind gives it more attention. It stays with it longer, explores it more deeply, connects it to other thoughts and experiences. That extended engagement reinforces the thought. It strengthens its presence, making it more likely to return. And when it returns with the same emotional tone, it feels consistent, like it is part of something stable, something that reflects who you are. This is why emotional thoughts feel so personal, not because they are more true, but because they are more intense, and that intensity makes them harder to separate from your identity. They don't just appear, they feel like they belong. Another layer comes from how your brain uses thoughts to guide behavior. Thoughts are not just passive. They often lead to decisions, actions, and responses. When a thought leads to something you do, it reinforces the idea that the thought is part of you. It becomes connected to your behavior, your choices, your outcomes. And that connection makes it feel more real, more integrated, more reflective of who you are, because your actions are part of your identity. And the thoughts that lead to those actions feel like they must be part of that identity as well. This creates a feedback loop. Thoughts influence actions, actions reinforce thoughts, and both strengthen the sense of self. And within that loop, it becomes even harder to separate the two. Thoughts don't just feel like something you have. They feel like something that defines what you do, and what you do feels like who you are. So the connection becomes stronger over time. Over time, all of these processes combine into something that feels stable, a consistent sense that your thoughts are yours, that they represent you, that they are part of your identity, and because this feeling is consistent, it becomes unquestioned. It feels obvious, natural, something that doesn't need to be examined, but that consistency is built on patterns, repeated interactions, repeated reactions, repeated associations between thoughts and identity. It is not something fixed. It is something that has been reinforced over time. And anything that is reinforced can also be seen differently, but until it is examined, it continues automatically. Thoughts appear, are treated as personal, are followed, are expanded, and become part of the ongoing sense of self. And that cycle keeps repeating. Not because thoughts are you, but because they are consistently experienced that way. If you look more closely at the timing of your thoughts, something subtle begins to stand out. A thought appears, and only after it appears do you become aware of it. There is no moment where you decide what the next thought will be before it arrives. It simply shows up, fully formed, and then you experience it. That sequence is easy to overlook because it happens so quickly. But it changes how thoughts can be understood. If you are not choosing the thought before it appears, then the thought is not being created in the way it feels. It is arising within your awareness, not being deliberately produced by you. And yet, the moment it appears, it is treated as something that belongs to you. This is where the illusion becomes strongest. Because the thought feels immediate, it feels intentional. It feels like something you are actively generating. But the reality is different. The thought arrives, and then you relate to it as if it came from you. That subtle shift from appearance to ownership is what creates the sense that your thoughts are you, even when they are not being chosen at all. There is also a continuity effect that reinforces this experience. Thoughts do not appear in isolation. Each one connects to the next, forming a sequence that feels smooth and uninterrupted. This sequence creates the impression of a continuous thinker. It feels like there is a single source producing all of these thoughts in order, one after another. But that impression is created by the connections between thoughts, not by a single controlling process. Each thought triggers the next through association, memory, and pattern recognition. And because those connections are seamless, it feels like one continuous stream rather than separate events. This is what gives rise to the sense of a stable identity within thinking. The flow feels unified, so it feels like it must be coming from a unified source, from you. But the flow is constructed from individual thoughts linking together, not from a single entity controlling them. And that distinction is hidden by how smooth the sequence feels. Another important detail is how your mind treats consistency. When similar thoughts appear repeatedly, they begin to feel like part of your character, your preferences, your fears, your tendencies. Because they show up often, they feel like something stable, something that defines how you think. But repetition does not equal identity. It only reflects what has been reinforced. If a certain type of thought has been engaged with repeatedly, it becomes more likely to appear again. And because it appears often, it feels like it must be part of who you are. This is how patterns turn into identity, not because they are inherently true, but because they are familiar and consistent. And once that connection is made, the thought feels more personal, more meaningful, more reflective of you, even though it is simply a pattern that has been repeated enough times to feel permanent. And that permanence is what makes it convincing. At this point, the connection between thoughts and identity begins to feel unquestionable. It doesn't feel like something that could be separated. It feels like a single experience. But when you begin to look at the structure more closely, the separation becomes visible. Thoughts appear. They are experienced and then they pass. They do not stay in a fixed state. They change, shift, disappear, and are replaced by something else. And yet your sense of self feels stable. It feels continuous, even though the thoughts themselves are constantly changing. That difference is important, because it shows that the thing experiencing the thoughts is not the same as the thoughts themselves. The thoughts are temporary, they come and go, but the awareness of them remains, and that awareness is what allows the thoughts to be noticed in the first place, which means the thoughts cannot be the same as the thing that is aware of them, even though it often feels like they are. As this becomes clearer, the experience of thinking begins to shift in a subtle but important way. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer carry the same automatic sense of ownership. Instead of feeling like something you are, they begin to feel like something you are aware of. That difference creates space. Not a large, obvious gap, but enough to notice that the thought exists within your awareness rather than defining it. Before, the moment a thought appeared, it was immediately treated as part of you. Now, there is a slight delay, a moment where the thought is seen before it is fully accepted, and in that moment, the entire structure begins to change. Because the thought is no longer fused with your identity. It is something that can be observed. This doesn't stop thoughts from appearing, but it changes how they are experienced once they do, and that change is what begins to loosen the connection that made them feel so personal in the first place. There is also a shift in how convincing thoughts feel when they are seen this way. When a thought is fully identified with, it feels absolute. It feels like a direct reflection of reality or of who you are. But when there is even a small separation, that certainty begins to change. The thought still appears, still carries its usual tone, but it no longer feels unquestionable. It becomes something that can be noticed without being immediately believed, something that can exist without being fully accepted. This reduces its influence, not because the thought disappears, but because it is no longer treated as something that must be followed or acted on. And over time, this changes how thoughts behave. They become less dominant, less persistent, less capable of controlling your attention, because their power came from being identified with. And once that identification weakens, so does their impact. Another important shift happens in how quickly thoughts pass when they are not identified with. When a thought is treated as part of you, it tends to stay. It is followed, expanded, connected to other thoughts. But when it is seen as something separate, it does not receive the same level of engagement. It appears, but it is not extended in the same way. And without that extension, it begins to fade, not instantly but naturally. It does not build into something larger. It remains a single event. This changes the rhythm of your thinking. Instead of continuous chains, there are individual thoughts that rise and fall, and that difference reduces the sense of being caught inside your own mind. Because the thoughts are no longer forming the same structures. They are appearing, but they are not accumulating, and without accumulation, there is no loop. There is also a deeper realization that begins to emerge. If thoughts can be observed, if they can be noticed as they appear and pass, then they cannot be the thing doing the observing. Because the observer and the observed cannot be the same in that moment. One is being experienced, and the other is aware of that experience. This creates a clear distinction. Thoughts are objects within awareness. They are events that occur, but they are not the awareness itself. And that awareness remains stable even as the thoughts change. It does not shift with each thought. It does not become different based on what appears. It simply notices. And that stability is what separates it from the thoughts themselves, because thoughts are constantly moving, constantly changing, constantly appearing and disappearing. But awareness does not behave in the same way, and that difference is what reveals that thoughts are not you. As this distinction becomes more consistent, the relationship with thoughts changes in a fundamental way. They no longer define your state in the same way. They no longer determine how you feel or what you focus on automatically. Instead, they become part of the background, something that can appear without taking over the entire experience. This reduces the sense of being controlled by your own thinking, because the thoughts are no longer directing everything that follows. They are present, but they are not dominant, and that shift creates a different kind of stability. Not the stability of having no thoughts, but the stability of not being moved by every thought that appears. And that stability is what allows your mind to feel less reactive, less repetitive, less overwhelming. Because the thoughts are no longer treated as something that must be followed. They are simply something that can be seen. This doesn't mean thoughts stop feeling real or convincing immediately. The patterns that created that feeling have been reinforced over time, and they don't disappear all at once. But the difference is that they are now visible. You can see how they form, how they try to pull your attention, how they attempt to connect into sequences, and that visibility changes how they function. Because something that is seen clearly does not have the same ability to operate automatically. It loses some of its influence simply by being recognized, and over time, that recognition becomes more consistent. Thoughts still appear, but they are less likely to be followed without awareness, and that reduces their ability to shape your experience in the same way they did before, because the process is no longer invisible, and what is no longer invisible is no longer automatic. What this ultimately reveals is that the feeling of being your thoughts is not a fixed truth. It is a result of how thoughts are experienced and interpreted over time. When they are constantly followed, constantly engaged with, constantly treated as personal, they begin to feel like part of you. But when they are seen as events that occur within awareness, that connection begins to loosen. And as it loosens, the entire experience of thinking changes. Thoughts still appear, but they do not carry the same sense of identity. They become something that is happening, rather than something that you are. And the difference changes how much influence they have, because they are no longer defining your experience, they are simply part of it. And once that becomes clear, even briefly, something shifts in how your mind feels. The constant identification with thoughts begins to weaken, and in its place, there is a sense of distance. Not disconnection, but clarity. The ability to see thoughts without becoming them. And that changes everything, because it removes the automatic link between thinking and identity. Thoughts can appear, but they do not have to define who you are. They can pass, without needing to be followed or believed. And in that shift, the entire experience of your mind becomes different, less reactive, less repetitive, less controlled by the patterns that once felt unavoidable, not because thoughts have stopped, but because they are no longer being mistaken for you.